Welcome back to another episode of The Bourbon Lens. This is Jake along with Scott, and today we've traveled east on I-64 to Frankfort. I had to do the directions in my head. I was like, did I get that right? I did. East on 64 from Louisville, and we landed in the state capital. And for those keeping track at home, Frankfort is the state capital. It is not Louisville, Kentucky. Let's get that straight once and for all for our outside listeners, outside of the great Commonwealth here. And we've landed at Buffalo Trace, and we're joined by probably one of the biggest personalities, I think. I see him all the time. He's got his own orange soda, Freddie Johnson, tour master himself. Freddie, thanks for joining the Bourbon Lens.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It means a lot to us that you're spending some time here as we get ready for Bourbon Heritage Month, as we are excited to celebrate that this year, as well as our 5-year anniversary of being a podcast, and to have a heritage brand like Buffalo Trace join us means a lot. So we really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
So Freddie, it's a wonderful spring day here. I'd say this is prime bourbon time, right? People are out and about traveling. So what's that mean for you all here at Buffalo Trace? How busy is it over these next several months?
This is, as you already recognized, it's the busy season for us. It really starts with right before Derby. Mm-hmm. It starts to build. People start getting interested in Kentucky. I think this year at Churchill Downs, they had record numbers. It was like, 100,000 more than the previous year. They went from 300 something to 400 something. Mm. And when they were interviewing the folks that were there, a lot of them were new. Mm. And that is what we're experiencing here. I think there's been a subtle transition from old school folks that kind of know the way whiskey is made, and they just want to come to the distilleries. They've been drinking this bourbon for years, and they just want to come and see it. And now it's like an explosion of a lot of younger folks. Mm-hmm. Jake, I just did a tour. It was 4 generations.
Wow.
The great-grandfather, the grandfather, the father, the son, their significant others. And I guess you could throw in the Holy Ghost, all of a sudden the Holy Ghost. Everybody was here for spirits. But the deal was, it was amazing. They all enjoyed aged bourbon. Mm. So they had stumbled into it, and they found out that it was a common connection between all of them, that they could sit and talk generational changes and enjoy the company of each other, and all the other differences went away. And I had an interesting time with them after the tour was over, just asking them, how did that happen? And they said it was because of what you did with Neat. And we realized that what you did with your dad and your brother was something that we had been doing for years, and we never really thought about the significance of sitting down with that bottle, and realizing that was the connection. And I said, "Wow, my goodness, this is kind of crazy." Yeah. But we just went through the same thing here. So we are rapidly approaching 500,000 visitors. That's just during this fiscal year, and that's running about 2 years. They had projected that would be in 2025.
Wow.
And so we're here now.
Yeah.
And so I think it's exciting.
Yep.
I think that I approach it with a degree of concern, because you have to be guarded about the hype. And too much hype can actually destroy what it's really all about.
Yeah.
That's an interesting perspective. I mean, really just think what gets lost in the discussion about how big bourbon has gotten is that it's really a drink to, have conversations over.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, I think that's really interesting, right? You talk about, this family and these conversations, and the new people come in, as a storyteller yourself, right? That's what we try to do here on the podcast. As a storyteller yourself, and going and talking about Buffalo Trace, because your family lineage goes right back, a long way with it as well. What's that like to tell the evolving story? Because I think some people think bourbon is dead, like from a story perspective, but brands like Buffalo Trace are continuing to evolve. So what's that like to evolve the story?
That's part of the tour. Mm-hmm. We take folks on a journey, and we start with when E.H. Taylor first basically created OFC back in the 1800s. And then you move forward from there, and they get a chance to see these old buildings. and then they see the new. So you alluded earlier to the new still that we just put in when you were talking about the new construction. But they get to go on a journey that starts with the original distillery and with the oldest residential building in Franklin County, which is the E.H. Taylor building.
Yeah.
And so we're taking them from the 1700s all the way through 2023.
Yeah.
And that journey is one that we don't rush them through it, and they get a chance to take it all in. So that's why we have like 4 different tours that they can take. So you get it in bits rather than just throwing everything at you all at once. And you're only going to remember about 10 or 15% of all that stuff that you get dumped with.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the reality that we deal with here is we want you to enjoy the distillery, but at the same time, that visit, the first tour that you take, the first person you encounter is your benchmark.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're shooting for here is we want that first encounter with the physical distillery to be one that's a positive one, because that's going to carry more weight than anything else that happens around here.
No, I think that's good. And I had never taken a tour up until recently. So being in bourbon and whiskey for, 5 years now, Scott and our previous podcaster had enjoyed the hallowed grounds of Buffalo Trace. I had not actually until I picked a barrel of whiskey in late 2022. And Lee was my tour guide. And we went through, Bourbon Pompeii, as they call it.
Yes.
And just to see the growth of distilleries from going to like in cement blocks, fermenting whiskey to, what you all are doing today. And it was right before the new still was set to go online. So we got to see it, but we couldn't see it. You know what I mean? And it's like, wow, production has completely changed, but it still has the same principles and roots as it did in yesteryear.
That's the key. So Jake, and Lee's really pretty cool.
Yeah.
He does some sculptural work.
Oh, cool.
When we leave out of here, I have a piece that I'd love to show you.
Yeah.
It's a bust of V.H. Taylor that he did. I mean, point on. He's a pretty cool guy. But we also have folks that are, another person is Jeff, and Jeff was with the forensic group for the state police. So we can talk nits and grits about chemical compositions, how things age, different types of alcohol and how they fit in. So we have a background of enough tour guides that when folks come in here, we can pretty much delve into anything they would like to discuss without boring everyone with the details. And Pompeii is really kind of cool for us because it is the only fermenter like it in the United States. There's a patent on it. So, and it takes longer to ferment the mash than it does in traditional fermenters. So we're learning about how you go about doing things like that. And like for Pompeii and the mash that's fermenting in there, I use the analogy of making yeast rolls.
Yeah.
And how you put the yeast into the dough, you knead it in, you wrap it in cheesecloth, you put it back in a cool, dark area. And then that helps them to understand the purpose of the copper.
Yeah.
So the copper acts like a heat sink, pulling the heat out of that fermenting mash. It slows the process down, but it allows the subtle essence of the grains to really become part of the taste profile of the whiskey.
Yeah.
And they're like, we get it.
Now it makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because you took a common thing like baking, and you related it to what seems like an uncommon thing and all these chemicals and the creation of whiskey, and you made a parallel.
Yep.
Right. And I think a lot of people will understand, like they saw mama or grandmama baking something, and they've seen that process, and so they get it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So, but it's fun. So we go from that to, Harlan Wheatley, our master distiller. He's got 2 engineering degrees.
Yep.
So, and one's in biochemical engineering. And he's doing a lot of work with the universities, especially with the University of Kentucky. But he does things with the farmers. If you look about the distillery as you hear the term campus all the time. Now, it's a campus. But the different departments are really just the different areas of production.
Yeah.
And so you start putting the piece parts together. And I had a session with Harlan one time. We were doing an off-premise event, and we started talking about the farmers and how he actually meets with the farmers that we get our grain from. And he invites them in here, and they get a chance to see how their grains are actually coming in from the farm, how we're handling those grains, and the significance of what their contribution is.
Yeah.
So I think that's what most people know. They like the product in the bottle.
Yep.
But they don't realize it starts with the farmer who produces the grains, and that's based on the soil that the grains came from.
Yep.
And if the farmer doesn't take care of the soil, the grains aren't going to meet their taste profile. So if you walk down the road, it's a nice journey, but then when you do take that sip, you really appreciate what you get.
That's why I like corn whiskey so much.
Yeah. Well, and it's really cool. Sustainability has also become a big thing, right? Because you're using a lot of corn, you're using a lot of rye, a lot of barley. What are you going to do with all the spent grain? And so it's really cool to be able to also reverse engineer the process. Hey, we're having the farmers in, but how is that impacting our cattle and the other, our pigs and whatever else that we may consume as humans? Like, they're enjoying some of the best mash in all the land.
Oh yeah. So our byproduct actually drives 5 other industries. So as they would say back in the day, that would be a term I would use as an old fart.
I use that term too, and I'm not old. At least I don't feel it.
So some of the distilleries still in liquid form, when the mash comes off the still, they just basically give it to the local farmers, and they put it into troughs and they feed it to them in liquid form. What we've discovered by that, when you have a large volume of mash that you're producing from your giant column stills, it takes roughly 8 to 10 bushels of grain to make a barrel of bourbon.
Yep.
So when you look at that, bushel of grain is like 45 to 50 pounds, depending on the grain. So for us right now, we're going through probably a little over 750,000 pounds of grain a day.
Wow.
So you start looking at that and you realize, okay, in liquid form, as you well know, if you go out onto a farm, you see a grain silo.
Yep.
When it gets damp, mold and mildew and those toxins get in there pretty fast.
Yep.
And if your livestock get a hold of it, it'll actually make them sick. So the byproduct that we're doing, we're actually running through an evaporator, and now we're using a centrifuge. We have a pretty high-tech dry house now. So we have 2 big giant centrifuges, and we're actually pulling the syrup out of it, evaporating out the water, and then we're injecting the syrup back into the mash and baking it like bran cereal. So when the livestock trucks come in here to pick up the grain, what they're actually doing is they are getting a product that is basically still warm. So by the time it gets to the feed companies, it's still warm, and they're not worried about mold, mildew, toxins, or anything like that. And it sets itself up for being pelletized, and they can basically convert it into a byproduct for the livestock right away. So, and that's a pretty good, so that process, the way it's set up, a lot of times these drivers get back-to-back loads.
Yeah.
So it allows us to continue to operate the stills without having to have a surplus of a lot of spent grain that basically is going to go to waste.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, like, bourbon being in Kentucky makes a whole lot of sense because it's an agricultural state, right? And so from the farmer to the producer of the product back to whatever the byproduct is, it makes a whole lot of sense because that's what the state has been based on since its inception.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think that's what people don't think. They're like, oh, bourbon, it's cool now. Well, bourbon was really cool 100 years ago too. And there's a little thing called prohibition, that kind of like cut it off at its knees. And we've been clawing back to that, process over time. And one of the reasons bourbon has become what it has been is because of Buffalo Trace. And you talked about the hype, but it's the amount of quality products that have been put out that people, enjoy.
Yeah.
And that has brought people to go and try different types of liquid. So what did, for you, as we talk, like move from agriculture into the product perspective and people enjoying it, how have you seen the hype? I like to call Buffalo Trace the master marketers, because you have created marketing campaigns and you've played on the hype itself, but you've also backed it up with good product, right? So it's not just hype, it's actual fulfillment. And what's it been like to you to see bourbon come back over the last, let's call it 20 years or so, and live up to the hype that you all have helped create?
So
that's a lot in one little segment there.
Yeah. I'm over here processing right now. Probably one way of capturing it is that when they made the decision to come up with Mash Bill 1, which is the Buffalo Trace recipe, they also made a business decision, a marketing decision, and that was, we're going to approach this like E.H. Taylor did. We're not going to advertise. We're going to go on premise.
Yep.
And they did it right here in the state of Kentucky. And they just went around. John Vericke was was the account manager. You had Harlan, you had Gary Gayhart, and Elmer. But the job was, you just went around on premise to restaurants, bars, taverns, and just gave free pours.
Yeah.
Tell us what you think. So it was done without a lot of hype, not a lot of pretense, not a lot of drum rolling or anything like that. It was like I guess the concept was, if this recipe, if this product does not make it in Kentucky, if people don't like it here in Kentucky, all the marketing money in the world and all the stars and all the athletes will not improve the taste of the product. And so it takes off here in Kentucky, and then it hits up into the Chicago area, and from there it just goes all the way out to the West Coast. So that was the first part of this, that when you asked me about Buffalo Trace, Buffalo Trace was basically standing on its own.
Yeah.
When people come in here, and we make a lot of product here, but they also know about a lot of the other products that are out there, and they'll ask questions like, well, Freddie, who do you think makes the best bourbon?
Yeah.
And I just look at them and smile and said, it doesn't matter what I think. I said, if you think about all the products that you are exposed to, the reason that they're on that shelf in that store is because somebody likes it. Because for that store, that's not a good business model to carry things that people don't like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they kind of like look at me, and I said, so I tell you to base it on what you enjoy. And I said, and that, Jake gets into what you were asking about. They're called price points. And I tell folks a lot of times, I said, just always remember proof and price.
Yeah.
Proof and price are never indications of age or of quality. But if you are a producer of a product, or if you're a bottler of a product, the person that encounters your first bottle, that's your benchmark. Their expectation is that you will be consistent with the taste profile of that product from that moment on, because I remember what it tastes like. That's the cool part about the human body is I smell it, I taste it, I roll it around on my palate, I swallow it, and I remember each of those components.
Yeah.
So for me, it's even though we make all of these products, each one, they're called expressions, and each one of those expressions is unique.
Yeah. Just makes you think, right? Like just the whole scheme of things. Like I love the way you approach that, because we talk about this all the time. Has there been pours from certain distilleries that have been like life-changingly good? Yeah, of course. But there's also ones that you can just pick up all the time that you enjoy because it's the same.
Yeah, you know what to expect.
Yeah.
It's comfort food.
Yeah.
I mean, for some people, I mean, that sounds silly, but if you go to the same pizza place because it's damn good pizza, you're going to keep going back.
I've got pizza places just like that.
Yeah. So it's like, you know what to expect when you're getting into it. That's why we also like to experiment and go up the price scale too with some of the expressions that come out, because, okay, they did it really damn well at $35, $45, $50. What are they doing at, in
the
the upper
high price
levels?
point. Yeah. No, that's so good. And like, for me, like to talk a little bit about Buffalo Trace, like, is it harder and harder to come by here in Kentucky? It is. Let's not call a spade a spade. But, when I want something a little bit sweeter with a lot of like, there's just a distinct cherry note that shows up for me in Buffalo Trace products. Like especially Buffalo Trace, the actual bottle. Like if I want something a little sweet, it makes a great old fashioned. It can be versatile on a rock and a neat pour. And it comes in at a price point normally under $30. Like that's a win for me. That's a great whiskey to always have available for me, my friends, and whoever else I'm going to enjoy that with.
Yeah.
And my other one that I always like to have, speaking of cocktails, I love to have Sazerac Rye because it's not always available. Like it kind of comes in waves, I feel like, to the market, but it is just a great solid rye whiskey that makes a killer old fashioned.
Yep.
Killer old fashioned.
Yep. And it's interesting that you use two different products and two different recipes, and both related back to the old fashioned.
Exactly.
So it gets at, Scott, what you were just talking about a moment ago, that consistency, like this is my comfort zone. This is my comfort pour. They're no longer called bartenders, as you well know. They're now mixologists, because a lot of those folks that are making drinks now are actually chemists.
Yeah.
All right. And so what they are doing is if they make a signature cocktail with your product, their reputation is riding on that. Their expectation is that your product is going to be consistent. That's why I'm going to you and putting my name associated with this product, is because it's a consistent taste profile. It's one that's easily received and welcomed. But you can do, like, if a person's in the habit of drinking wine or craft beers, an old fashioned made with Buffalo Trace, perfect, because it's got those fruity notes. It's got some some nice little things that don't slam you.
Yeah.
But if I'm a person that normally just sits around and drinks my product neat, make me an old fashioned with a Saz rye, and I'm still getting those fruity notes, but I get the additional punch of the rye.
Yeah.
It's there and it's just subdued. So those are the kinds of things that people don't realize until they sit down. And I'll tell folks a lot of times, if you're wondering about a product, if you're thinking about buying a product, especially if it's a higher price point, I tell them, get with a couple of friends, go into one of your favorite watering holes and get a flight.
Yep.
And in that flight, get 2 or 3 of these that you are about to spend, a few bucks for, and then get your comfort one, the one that you like in that recipe, whether it's a straight rye or a bourbon or wheat bourbon. I said, and sit there with your friends and sip, have some water, chat a little bit, kind of like let your palate get calibrated and stuff like that. And I said, a lot of times you're going to be blown away at the fact that the one you're about to spend the most money for is not the one that you like the best. And so I think that's creating what you were just talking about, Jake. It creates a level playing field, and it helps people to realize they need to trust their own palate, not what somebody says.
Yeah. I mean, Scott, I kind of admire you. Every time we get together for a podcast, you always have a baseline pour. Like you have a base whiskey that you enjoy, and you're like, I compare it against that. That's your 50%. Like that's your good margin whiskey.
Yeah, you can go up or down from there. And
yeah,
it's just that, not to use a Buffalo Trace term, but that's a benchmark.
Yeah.
And benchmark bourbon used to be one of those bourbons for me that when people were like, what does bourbon taste like? I'm like, this is what bourbon should taste like. Like it tastes like corn. It's got, a little bit of spice, got a little proof punch to it, not overwhelming, but that's why I do that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And that's one of those that you don't care how they drink it. You just go and have a good pour.
Yeah.
And you'd mentioned like Buffalo Trace. We'd had a discussion with Harlan one time, and he said that the reason he likes Buffalo Trace so much is, he said, it's a balanced bourbon. So you're getting that punch that you would associate with a rye on the front, but then you get the sweetness of the corn, you get a few soft fruity notes, and then the finish, it lingers, but it's not extremely long.
Yeah.
But it's a nice finish to the pour itself. And I think that's what a lot of people, if you talk to some of them, they'll get a hold of some of these that it just basically cooks inside of their mouths.
Yeah.
And they're like, wow, man, that was smooth. And I'm like, when I hear those words, I'm like,
Yeah.
no, that wasn't what we call smooth.
135 proof whiskey, smooth.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
like when you
Have your taste buds like just totally
Yeah, you're
singed
toasted,
off?
yeah.
when Freddie sees the guest kind of like, close both of his eyes and go,
little teardrop comes out of the corner of the eye.
and they're like,
Yeah.
that was good and smooth. And you're like, yeah, I'm sure it was.
Yeah.
It's like the first time you ever have stag, right? It's like, you're like, wasn't ready for that one.
No. And in fact, Jake, that's a fun thing that I do with the tours. The term for it is called acclimation.
Yeah.
And if you've never tried it, I'll tell folks, just take a sip of water, basically send the palate to neutral. I said, and then take that product and kiss it. I said, you're not trying to drink it. I said, just kiss it and let the tip of your tongue and your lips get acclimated to the alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, and then you're going to come back, take a sip of water, hold the water in your mouth, and then revisit that pour with the water in your mouth. Played with that, gentle swallows, and then come back with a sip neat. And what a lot of people realize is that holding the water in your mouth first and then taking the sip, it cuts it.
Yeah.
If you do the reverse of that, you've already got the heat of the alcohol and it tastes watered down.
Yep.
It's really kind of crazy, but you get folks to do that and you realize when you're doing that, one bourbon is neat. For another person, that might be a flick of water.
Yeah.
For another person, it's a splash of water. And that same bourbon for a newbie is going to be bourbon on the rocks. That's going to be bourbon with ginger or bourbon in 7. It's because their palate is just not used to alcohol at those concentrations. And if you don't help them go gently into the night, what happens is, I've had that before, and I would prefer not to have that one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's been, I don't even know how long it's been, but one of the first tours I did on the bourbon, as a bourbon experience was here, and Freddie was my tour guide. And I do remember that tasting. Like, it's something I still think about, like how to taste whiskey. It's like, you got to warm yourself up because you're just going to burn your palate out if you don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's, it can go quick if you don't pay attention, to it. That's for sure. Yeah. That's one of the things that I learned because I was a bourbon newbie. I always like to tell the story, and it'll be even more right up the alley to tell this story. And every listener, I'm sorry, you're going to hear this for the 500th time. The first time I ever bought whiskey myself, I went to a Rite Aid in Lexington, right near campus. And I had $30. Well, you go over to the liquor shelf. Rite Aid used to be really good. Don't go over to Rite Aid now. Probably not much there.
Yep.
You may find Buffalo Trace, maybe. But there said a black and gold label, Weller 12. And it was like, $26.
Oh, I'm having a meltdown. I'm having a meltdown.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorites.
Yeah. So, and that was and I was like, oh, well, I have $30 to spend. Like, I'm going to 26. I got $4 left over. I think I got a bag of chips. And walked out and everyone was like, oh man, you got Weller 12? Like, you didn't get the rock gut? And I'm like, no, if I have $30 to spend, I'm going to buy something good.
It was payday.
Yeah. And so that was the first time I ever had encountered, Buffalo Trace products was Weller 12. And, then I tried to replicate that experience, right? Like, I couldn't ever find it again. Bourbon started to get hot and, it slowly dissipated away. But those are the things like that I love is that experience that is shared, telling stories with friends, because that's a fun story for me. One, being chastised by my teammates at the time for picking up a nice bottle of bourbon. Now they're like, I wish I had a bottle of Weller 12.
I wish I would have bought the whole shelf.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure there was like a little thing called, old Rip Van Winkle 10-year sitting there for $60, which Julian would say, if you've read the book Pappyland, that it should be $60 at all time because it's a good sipping bourbon. Yeah. But those are the stories. So I want to ask you this. We're here celebrating our 5-year anniversary. What's been one of your like monumental stories that you kind of have, like that was kind of like, man, this is going to stay with me forever, whether it's you and your dad drinking whiskey or, something that happened here at Buffalo Trace. What's been that kind of monumental story for you with you and bourbon?
So if the listeners have not seen Neat.
Yeah.
So Neat tells the story of the relationship I had with my dad and the last bottle of bourbon, which was a Pappy.
Yeah.
That story is the one that they can see. And a lot of people come in here, they've seen it, and they'll tell me that's why they're here.
Yeah.
And they'll be with their father or their grandfather. We've had some really interesting folks, and that's why they're here. So that piece is kind of understood. The lighter piece, the one that tells you that you're planting seeds, are the really cool ones, like this mother and her son popped by Buffalo Trace Distillery a few years back, and he was in his sophomore year of college, and his major was chemistry. And so we're bopping around, and she said, I was just wondering, I wanted to take my son on a tour, and we happen to be in the area. And so I figured, come by the distillery and maybe we can take a tour. So we go on a little behind the scenes hard hat tour combo arrangement. And we get up by the stills and we do the waking of the dog. And he was only 19 at the time. So his mother had to hold it in her hand, and he got the chance to smell it. And we smack our hands and rub it. And he sees the alcohol, the strength of the alcohol in the grains, and then the viscosity to feel afterwards. And they had a ball. We had a lot of fun. And they leave. I hadn't heard from these folks forever. And I was doing, I do a lot of behind the scenes tours at other distilleries. I just go in and I'm incognito and we're fiddling around and stuff. And I'm on this tour at this distillery, and he is now the master distiller at this distillery. And a lady in the group says, wow, she says, you're a master distiller? And he was like, yeah. He says, at the time, he says, I'm the youngest master distiller for the state of Kentucky.
I now know who we're talking about.
and so she was like, well, what made you want to become a master distiller? He said, well, it's the craziest thing. He says, I was on a tour at Buffalo Trace Distillery with my mom.
That's crazy.
And we were doing this tour, and I got this tour guide, and he took us up by the stills and the fermenters, and he says, it's him. And he says, Freddie, what you doing here at the distillery? And so that started the whole thing.
Oh, man.
And then he told the story about how that moment planted a seed, and he was like, I can do this. And it's Caleb.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, but Caleb and Corky and all of them, really, I know them. And so, we were just at the Icons of Whiskey.
Yeah.
And, he got recognized as the master distiller. And I was like, how cool is this? Mm-hmm. Here's a kid that's basically just trying to figure out what does he want to do in life.
Yeah.
And you plant a seed that makes a difference in not only his life, but all the folks that get a chance to enjoy that product.
Yeah.
That's what's cool about all this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that is.
So.
Well, that's a hell of a story. Like, I don't know any two ways to slice that one.
Yeah. And going back to the beginning of the story, if you haven't watched Neat, you got to watch Neat. Like, it's required. It's like required reading.
Yeah.
In high school, it's required for your bourbon, your bourbon experience.
Yeah.
But it's Jake, it was what you had mentioned earlier when you started this. It's no different than when you guys started your podcast.
Yeah.
You're planting seeds. The only way that you move forward from that point is if you're producing something that's value added to me.
Yeah.
So I only have so many days, hours, months, years on this earth, as do any of us. And so if I give you some of my time and it's value added, I don't mind giving you more of my time. Okay.
Yeah.
But if my first encounter with you, I feel like, well, that's a waste. You're going to have a tough time getting me to sit down and spend time with you and Scott again. So,
It only took you 5 years.
It only took a couple trips around the sun to make this happen. But no, I mean it's been good because over this we've hit a lot on Buffalo Trace, but I want to come to Freddie because you've become an icon in the bourbon world yourself, and you may not think that, but as someone on the outside looking in, like when I think of people that have done some really cool stuff that are not master distillers. You mentioned Peggy No earlier when we were just chatting. We think about Fred Minnick or some of these other folks. Your name kind of comes to my head, and that's just my opinion. And it's really cool. So what's it been like to work for a team that's allowed you to tell your story, that allows you to come to work and have fun? Because I think that's what I can see, and based upon this conversation, like no days wasted for you. And this is not a job. This is fun for you.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was one of the things that when I called it promises made, promises kept. So the reason I'm really here is I'd made a promise to my dad and my granddad. As a kid running around here, I started playing around here when I was like 5 years old. And I'd made a promise to them that Dad was like, well, it'd be nice if, if you would come to work at the distillery, and that way we can say we had 3 direct generations to work at Buffalo Trace Distillery. And, I'm like, yeah, Dad, sure. I'll do that. And sometimes life has a plan. As I shared with my dad one time, my dad was upset because all of our family members, our direct family members, mom, dad, my brother, my sister, everyone had passed away with the exception of the 2 of us. And we were heading to the hospital, and he just screamed out. He said, "Thy will be done." And I'm like, I go running out the door, and I said, "What was that about?" He said, "I was just thinking that it's only the 2 of us left." And I was upset because this was not the way I had it planned. He thought he would be the first one to go, and we had a trust fund set up, and it would trickle down, and my daughter would be my sister would have been the recipient of, if anything happened to the rest of us, she would be but everyone was gone with the exception of 2 of us. And he said, I was just angry at the fact that this didn't go the way I had it planned. And I looked at him and I smiled and I said, "Dad," I said, "who said it was your plan?"
Yeah.
I said, "Who said you had the master plan?" And he just looked at me and he says, "I never thought about that." I said, "There's something bigger than us that has caused us to be here together." And his return was, he says, "Well, I don't really know what the plan is." He says, "But I hope that I go before you." And I said, "What's that about?" And he says, "Don't take it the wrong way." He says, "But I've really enjoyed this journey that we've been on. And I just can't think of going on this journey if you're not around." So that's when you realize, for me, he became terminally ill. I'm trying to take care of him, but trying to keep my other job going, and it wasn't working. And so I took early retirement and came back to take care of him. Because I came back, he wanted me to be at this distillery with him so he could tell me all the things that had happened around here and how the warehouses were built and where the honey barrels came from and all that stuff. And so he has me come down here, and he and Mark Brown, our president, he and Mark had this little encounter when they were transitioning from Ancient Age to Buffalo Trace. And in the midst of all that, he said, "My boy's coming back." He says, "And I really would like for you to see if we can find a job for him around here." And so Mark was asking about my background and all this kind of stuff. And he says, "Well, I want him to do something that I think he can do." And he says, I think he might be able to be a tour guide." And that started the whole thing. So people, we laughed about it at the time. But then later on, when this thing really started to take off, some of them kept asking me and said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "Be a tour guide." And they said, yeah. But with your background and everything else, you already understand how the distillery works. What do you really want to do? I said, be a tour guide. I said, I've already had a career. I already understand price points and, your performance indicators and all the other stuff that goes with managing a lot of people. At one point, I had 750 people reporting to me. It's like, I've already been through all that.
Yeah.
I said, I just want to be a tour guide. But the bottom line to it was simply this. At some point in your life, you'll realize you're kind of happy where you are.
Yeah.
And so that's when you have to say, okay, I can continue to do things for myself, or I can help make the world a better place by planting seeds with others.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I think that goes to show with your personality and everything. It's great because it's not about you, but then there's been some cool things that's happened because of putting people first, and that's really cool. And like those are the type of people that I like to associate with, like just as an individual, because you're not just bringing yourself up, you're bringing the collective up, and that's a huge honor to spend some time with you and just hear these stories because they're moving for sure. Yeah.
So at the end of the day, when I no longer walk this earth, the lives that I've touched, that's my legacy. And somebody say, well, what's your tangible? And that's that it's the folks that remember things that we've done together.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard, have you taken a tour of any bourbon distilleries? Have you taken a tour of Buffalo Trace? And did you take a tour of Freddie?
Yeah.
Like that's like the three questions that come up. Like it's like you got to check those off your box.
Yeah. Well, and I think today, like even though we're not touring with Freddie, we just toured with Freddie. Like everyone just who's listened to this just toured a little snippet of Freddie's life. Yeah. And that's cool because the distillery has been so intertwined into who you are and who your family is. And that's awesome.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. So I've got my grandson now. So my daughter, I'd mentioned working, and she said, "Dad, I'm not rolling any barrels." So I said, "Just forget that part." But my grandson Osiris, he's everybody thinks that their kids are the smartest kids in the world. So you know how that goes. But he is a pretty cool kid, and he has helped me roll out the 7 millionth and the 8 millionth barrel.
I thought that when I think it was Governor Brashear was here, and you all wrote it. I thought that was your grandson was with you all on that one. So
it's really kind of cool. So up until recently, we averaged 1 million barrels once every 10 years.
Yep.
So the 6 millionth that I helped my dad roll out, between the 6 millionth and the 7 millionth, was 10 years, which is what we were averaging. So we hit the 7 millionth. Dad's passed away. We get Osiris out of school. He helps me roll, which was fun with the teachers, by the way. But anyway, so we get Osiris to help me roll the 7 millionth barrel. But then we hit the 8 millionth barrel in 4 years. All right. So now we're rapidly approaching 1 million barrels once every 3 years.
Yeah.
So it's amazing, the two pictures of Osiris. Just in 4 years, the kid's gone from down here. It's like now he's bigger than I am.
Doubled in height.
And it just brings back home, Jake, what you and Scott and I have been talking about is that time in a barrel. If you look at the sequence of events in your life, during those periods of time from when the new entry, when the whiskey, that spirit went into the barrel, until it's bottled and it's on the shelf that you're drinking it. What events occurred during your life during that period of time? If it's a Buffalo Trace 8-year, or if it's a Eagle 10, or it's a Weller 12, what events happened? So that's why I thought that when they did the OSC 25 release, that little time capsule of all the things that went on during the course of those 25 years, I still read that little pamphlet, and I think about all the other things that I personally encountered during that period of time.
Wow.
No, that's huge. I mean, like just to think about that in that way. And it's big. Like I have so many thoughts right now. It's hard to kind of get them all out, but man, this is thought provoking.
It is. It is. It never dawns on you. You sit there and you're critiquing the product. Well, I tasted a little bit of this, got some vanilla. little bit of fig there. Oh, some apricots. Yeah. I never think about, well, at what point from the moment the whiskey went into the barrel, did that taste profile evolve because of that spirit's relationship with the wood? At what point does cherries come into the picture?
Yeah.
And so would that be 4 years in the barrel? What was I doing 4 years ago?
Yeah.
It's I mean, it just I like I say, I do some kooky stuff sometimes. I'll give you one since you mentioned Weller 12.
There we go.
All right. I'm going to give you, I call it the ultimate flight.
Okay.
I've done a couple of off-premise tastings, and this person told me, says, price is not an object. Tell me the pours that I need so that my friends and I can have what you would consider an ultimate pour. I said, okay. I said, we're going to do it with Weller. All right. So we're going to start with the White Dog off the still. So that goes in. So that was the first pour. The first release of a wheated product is Weller Special Reserve, 7 years old. I said, all right, so that's your second pour. I said, so what we're going to do is a lot of people, when they do tastings, they take you through a vintage, through a maturity program. I said, but your proof is constantly going up and down.
Yeah.
So you're really yanking your palate around. I said, so what we're going to do is new entry, Weller Special Reserve. And I said, and then we're going to lock in on a proof for the next pours. And they were like, how are you going to do that? And I said, go on this journey with me. Watch what happens. So White Dog, 7 years. The next release of Weller is 107. Yeah. It's Weller Antique. Mm-hmm. I said, so that's your third pour. Your next pour at 107 proof, what is it? And they were like, what? I said, I think it's called Old Rip Van Winkle. Mm-hmm. It's 10 years old, 107 proof. I said, so this is the same recipe, and all you've done is gone from the baby to the first release, like going into kindergarten. Now you're at Weller Antique 107. I said, and then you go to Old Rip Van Winkle 107. I said, so what's the next release at 107 proof in our wheated bourbon? It's Pappy 15, 107 proof.
Yeah.
And I said, and your final pour is going to be William LaRue Weller Uncut Unfiltered Barrel Proof, which is basically in that same window of time. 6 pours, and we spent the whole evening on 6 pours, and they were blown away from its inception to one of the highest rated bourbons in the world. And you go on that journey with 6 pours, and it's a really cool journey. So that's the ultimate flight for me.
Mm. That sounds tasty.
Yeah.
Quite tasty.
Yeah. So that's one you can think about and chat about. I've been trying to figure out how do I do that with our Mash Bill 1 with the Buffalo Trace. And that one would be White Dog, and you start with Benchmark, and we got different things with Benchmark. But then I'm trying to figure out how do I take Benchmark and take it all the way through to the ultimate pour there. I mean, you could continue to go to OFC 25, but that's really a whole lot of expressions. And if I wanted to do the same thing, I would end up with George T. Stagg at 15 years old. And then you could back off to that, but the proof of the products actually bounces around.
They weave a lot because stag batch to stag batch is different.
Yeah. And Eagle Rare is different. And so that one, I just try to tell folks, if you're trying to compare products or you're trying to compare recipes, you want something that the alcohol concentration is the same, and then that helps you to appreciate time in a barrel. Yeah. And what that does to enhance the taste profile.
Well, now he's got my taste buds thinking.
Start building a flight.
Yep. Start trying to find friends that have bottles.
And that's what we did. And then that's what he did. And they just basically, it ended up, nobody really spent a lot of money because everybody had at least one of those bottles. Yeah. And they could do the pour.
Mm. We one of our most popular episodes actually was our Weller Bourbon Flight. And we did Special Reserve 107 CYPB first release. Yeah. Weller 12. Did we have 4 or 5? Did we have Full Proof then? I think we might have Full Proof.
Full Proof had just come out.
Full Proof had just come out. So we did a flight of those 5, and we did it blind. And that was very interesting to see them blind because CYPB is uniquely different than the rest of the Wellers.
And based on consumers' input.
Yeah.
That's how it came about. But it is unique, but it is also hot.
Yeah. And it's very perfumey to me. Like it's a very floral product, where the other ones, you get a lot of the sweet caramel, weeded bourbon traditional notes. Yeah. That one is definitely something different, but it's really good. If you can find one. Someone
price point on it's out the roof. So
yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah. If I recall correctly, that was the one I selected blind.
That was your favorite one.
My favorite, but I think it's probably because it stood out the most out of the lineup.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of the upper floors of the warehouse. So that heat is going to enhance some of those things. And it's like, well, you really, really got to be very, very guarded, because probably going much longer than that up there, it would have really kind of cooked it.
Yeah.
But it's gosh, we don't want to get started on warehouses and all that kind of stuff. But
next time,
that's another journey. Yeah, that's another journey.
Well, Freddie, this has been awesome. We appreciate you taking us down memory lane, telling us the story of Buffalo Trace and how you and your family's been interwoven throughout that. Can you tell people, if they don't know or they live under a rock, where they can find out more about Buffalo Trace and all the products?
The easiest way to do that is just go to buffalotrace.com.
Yep.
And when you hit that, you're going to get a real nice portfolio of things that you can do. Everything from products to a little bit of the history of those products to our master distillers to E.H. Taylor. I mean, to me, it's one of the easiest things to navigate and go specifically to what you want without having to go down through a whole lot of stuff just to try to get to something that you're looking for. We have a consumer section in there that you can go in there and you can ask questions.
Yeah.
And we have folks, Alan, I was doing a tour yesterday, and Alan, who is part of our consumer affairs group, and he popped into our group. And I realized that he was standing in there. He was actually on his way home, and he was standing there. And I said, Alan, and so I let the group meet him. And he got a chance to talk a little about it. I said, you know about the whiskey in the bottle? I said, but you would be amazed at the number of inquiries that we get. And sometimes people are even more surprised when they get an immediate response back by a person, not just a generic kind of a thing. And I said, here's one of those folks. So Alan got a chance to interact with them and tell them a little bit about what he does and some of the questions and how they respond, and a little bit about that section of Buffalo Trace. So I think that's the piece that I think people are beginning to realize that that's something Buffalo Trace does.
Yeah.
It's just the culture is entirely different. And it was based on a vision. So the vision started with E.H. Taylor putting club cars on his trains. It was to entertain politicians and constituents, and he could take them he had all of his distilleries connected by rail. And he could do a little tour with you and chat with you and make you appreciate what was going on. And so you got a chance to see his distillery, but you also got a chance to interact with him one-on-one.
Yeah.
And that was a byproduct of the whiskey in the bottle.
Yeah.
So that's why, whenever I'm doing tours, if someone is associated with an area, a lot of times people coming here on tours, if there's someone in that area doing some work and there's a question, the tour guides will let those folks answer the questions. They get a chance to interact with them, so they get an emotional connection with the distillery that goes beyond the liquid in a bottle.
No, I think that's impactful. And that's why, 500,000 people have come and visited Buffalo Trace so far this year.
Yeah.
Well, Freddie, thank you so much for your time. Thanks, Buffalo Trace and the team that has set this up for this interview. As always, thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Bourbon Lens. We truly appreciate it. If you want to find out more about Bourbon Lens, go over to Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Bourbon Lens. If you want to join our growing Patreon community, go over to patreon.com/Bourbon Lens. And last but not least, if you do us a favor, go to your favorite podcast listening app, give us a review, and hit that subscribe button. We'd greatly appreciate it. And until next time, cheers.
Cheers. Thanks, Freddie.